I live in a small town in the countryside, a place where most people know the lives and stories of everyone around them. I grew up here in a simple house, at the edge of an unpaved street with the sound of crickets always accompanying the warm summer nights. Many say it's a peaceful place, but there are things that happen here that none of us can explain. It was just another late afternoon. I was heading to my friend Lucas's house to pick up some things he had lent me. The way to his house is simple. You pass by the central square where there's always a group of young people sitting on the few concrete benches, and then you continue along the dirt road with some scattered trees until you reach a more secluded area. Lucas's house was almost on the edge of the road, on a plot surrounded by a rusty wire fence. It was an old house but very cozy. Before arriving, I passed by a street that always gave me the chills. I didn't know exactly why, but every time I passed there, a strange feeling would take over me. It was a darker street, full of trees that, as the sun set, seemed to swallow the light. And it was there, at the end of this street, that the abandoned house stood. The house had been empty for many years. I heard it was once home to a couple who died under mysterious circumstances, but no one knew exactly what had happened. Some people said the man had gone mad and the woman had disappeared, while others said the house had been the scene of a murder. The thing is, the house had always been empty with broken windows and faded paint, looking more like a shadow than an actual building. I was never one to get involved in mysteries, but something told me that house wasn't normal. I always felt a pressure on my chest whenever I passed by, as if an invisible presence was watching me. And that afternoon, with the sun already low on the horizon, I was there once again, staring at that crumbling house, thinking about the stories I had heard since I was a child. That's when suddenly something happened. A noise, a sound coming from inside the house like something had hit a wall. I froze, staring at the house, my heart racing. I knew the house was empty, no one lived there, but the sound was unmistakable, as if someone was moving inside. Curiosity, as always, was stronger. I decided to investigate. After all, the house had been there for years, no one dared to enter, and I was just a guy looking for a story. The path to the house's entrance was simple, and I clearly remember the smell of mold and rotting wood when I stepped onto the property. The rusty wire fence was broken in several places, allowing me to pass without difficulty. The gate was open, gently swaying with the wind that had begun to blow cold. I entered the room through the slightly open door. The smell of mold was stronger, and the feeling of oppression was unbearable. It felt like the air was denser, harder to breathe. When I looked to the center of the room, I saw something I will never forget. There was a chair, an old wooden chair, in the center, but it wasn't an ordinary chair. It was spinning slowly as if someone was sitting there, moving in a strange, unhurried way. The room was empty, but the chair was moving by itself. I didn't know what to do. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but something inside me told me to leave, to run away from that cursed house. But before I could move, a low, guttural sound echoed from the darkness of the room. It was as if someone was breathing heavily, close, very close to me. I froze. I couldn't move anymore, as if something invisible was holding me there, trapped. The cold intensified, and the feeling that there was something with a strong and malevolent presence in the room enveloped me completely. I managed to take a step back, but at that moment, the chair stopped. The sound of the breathing ceased, and everything became eerily silent. I knew something was there, watching me, waiting for me to be weak enough to make the wrong move. I ran to the stairs, left the house in a complete panic, not looking back. The gate was still open, and as I passed through it, I felt the weight of the house on me as if it were watching. And since that day, I could never look at that house the same way again. Even now, whenever I pass by, the feeling of being watched takes over me again, and a part of me knows that what I saw that night wasn't something that could be easily explained. Today, looking back, I wonder what really happened in that house. I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. It wasn't just a feeling of fear. It was something deeper, something beyond our understanding. Perhaps the couple never left, and the house somehow became a vessel for their lost souls. Even worse, when I entered the house, everything was immersed in a thick darkness. Even with the sun still visible on the horizon, the shadows inside the house seemed endless. It was as if the light didn't want to enter there. I wasn't alone. The atmosphere had a strange vibration, as if time had stopped there, frozen in a distant era. The smell of mold was intense, and the sound of my boots hitting the wooden floor echoed as if every step were an affront to that house, as if it were watching me, waiting. I walked around for a few minutes, exploring the rooms. What caught my attention the most was a large living room with a fireplace in the back. The walls were covered with old dirty tapestries, and most of the furniture was broken or covered in a thick layer of dust. But what really made me stop was the painting on the wall. It was an old black and white painting of a couple. The man had a serious look, his eyes fixed on some distant point, while the woman seemed to be looking at him with a sad expression, as if waiting for something. A chill ran down my spine. Something about that painting unsettled me, as if the image were trying to tell me something. I touched the frame with the tips of my fingers, and at that moment the temperature in the room dropped. Then I heard the noise again. A sound coming from upstairs, as if something were dragging itself. It wasn't the wind nor the wood creaking. It was something deeper, more disturbing. I hesitated for a moment. Fear began to consume me, but curiosity once again took over. I climbed the stairs, which creaked with every movement. The floor on the upper level was covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs, but something was different there. The corridor was narrow and dark, and the doors of the 3 rooms were closed, but one of them was slightly open. This isn't something that can be explained logically. Sometimes fear isn't in what you see, but in what you feel. My name is Lucas. Here, time seems to pass slower, and life follows a rhythm that for many is even considered monotonous. However, like any place, we also have our stories, and today I will tell one of the most disturbing ones I have ever lived. Something that happened a few years ago, but still haunts me every time night falls, and the deserted road appears before my eyes. It was a hot summer afternoon, one of those stuffy days where the air felt heavy and suffocating. I was heading home after a quick trip to a neighboring town, where I went to take care of some business for my father. The return trip would be peaceful, as I was already familiar with the road. An old dirt road that cut through the region, mostly used by locals but well known to everyone. The road, which was about 30 kilometers from my town, was isolated, with only a few houses along the way. I always avoided traveling on it at night, because there were old stories about apparitions and strange phenomena. But that day, as always, I felt calm and confident, despite knowing about those legends. It was getting dark, the sky tinged with a deep red as the sun set behind the mountains. The road was quiet, and the feeling of desolation that it always caused me didn't seem as strong. I drove alone, just listening to the sound of the tires on the asphalt and the engine of the car, which, having been on the road for over 10 years, emitted a monotonous and comforting rumble. I enjoyed the feeling of being there, with the window open, feeling the warm wind and the smell of the dirt road. What I didn't expect was for something to happen, something that would forever change my perception of reality, and make me question everything I thought I knew about the world. I was about 10 kilometers from my town when, in the middle of the road, I noticed a figure in the distance. First, I thought it was a local, maybe someone who had stopped their car for some reason. But as I got closer, I began to realize that something was wrong. It was a woman. She was standing in the middle of the road, not moving. Her clothes were simple but torn, as if she had been walking for days with no destination. Her hair, dark and tangled, fell messily over her face, covering part of her features. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and she didn't seem to realize I was approaching. I slowed down, feeling a chill run up my spine. There was something unsettling about the way she was standing there, in the middle of a deserted road. I braked completely, stopping just a few meters from her. The silence was absolute, not even the sound of crickets or the wind blowing through the trees around us. She stood still, but my eyes were fixed on her, as if an invisible force was compelling me to look. I was about to ask if she needed help when she finally lifted her head. That's when everything changed. When she looked at me, I felt as if the world had stopped. I can't explain what was so terrifying about her eyes, but something in that expression made me freeze. They weren't human eyes. They were deep, empty, as if there was no soul behind them, only darkness. It was as if she was seeing through me, understanding me on a level I can't describe, something beyond human comprehension. She didn't say anything. She just continued to stare at me, motionless. I was about to turn the car on and drive away when, out of nowhere, the sound of a distant scream cut through the air. It wasn't a normal scream, but something deep and full of anguish, coming from somewhere far away, yet at the same time echoing inside my head. Without thinking, I started the car and sped up. I didn't want to stay there any longer, and the feeling that something was terribly wrong consumed me. When I looked in the rearview mirror, the figure of the woman was still there, in the middle of the road, watching me as I drove away quickly. The return. I barely managed to get home that night. The road seemed endless, and the fear grew with every kilometer. I kept looking in the rearview mirror constantly, but I saw nothing anymore. Just the empty, dark, and silent road, as if nothing had happened. When I finally arrived home, the feeling of terror was still with me, and I couldn't sleep properly. I knew there was something more on that road, something that wasn't human. The next day, with my mind still clouded by the experience of the previous night, I went to the local police station to talk to the officer, Sergio, a trusted man, someone who always had answers for everything. I knew he wouldn't judge me for it. When I told him what had happened, he looked at me with a serious expression. He asked me not to take that route at night anymore. And then he started to tell me a story he had heard when he was younger, something that was always treated as a legend in the town. The woman I saw, he said, wasn't an ordinary person. She was known as the Lady of the Road. The legend said that she was a woman who died in an accident on that road many years ago, and her spirit never found peace. She appeared to people, but not in an aggressive way. She would watch them silently like a warning. But the most terrifying part of the story was the ending. They say that once you see her, you can't escape her. The legend claimed that she never left a victim alive after an encounter. The woman, or the being, whatever it was, always followed its victim, appearing in dreams and anywhere the person was alone, until finally something worse would happen. No one knew exactly what happened, but everyone who saw the Lady of the Road was never the same. Some disappeared, others became seriously ill, and others simply went insane. I spent the following days trying to ignore what had happened. I went back to the road but avoided that stretch. Everything seemed to be in order, but on those nights something strange happened. I felt an inexplicable cold, a sensation that something was watching me. I saw her in my dreams, the woman with the empty eyes staring at me in silence. Each night her presence grew stronger, more tangible. I could no longer distinguish reality from my nightmares. It was then that one night while I was trying to sleep, I heard a sound. The sound of a car approaching. That familiar sound, the rumble of the tires on the dirt road. I went to the window and looked outside. The car was stopped on the road right in front of my house. There was no one inside. And then I saw it. A woman, the same one I had seen weeks earlier, was standing at the door of my car watching me through the window. And that's when I realized the legend wasn't just a story, it was real. She had never stopped following me. I didn't know what else could happen, but something told me that what I saw on that road was just the beginning of something much worse. Sometimes there are mysteries that should never be unraveled, that we should never try to understand. Perhaps the legend of the Lady of the Road is a warning not to venture into places that carry unresolved stories, with presences that no longer belong to the world of the living. My name is Evan, and I am from a coastal town. Since I was a child, I have always been fascinated by mystery stories, especially those related to the sea and isolated islands. However, I never imagined that one of these stories would happen to me in such a real way. This happened a few years ago when I was invited by a friend to take a trip to a small island about 30 kilometers off the coast, an island that over the years had been abandoned and forgotten by everyone. It was a hot January day, the kind of day that seems to stretch endlessly. I was at home resting after a week of hard work when I received a call from my friend Gustavo. He invited me to spend the weekend on a distant island, a place he had heard about from an old sailor. The plan seemed simple: a boat ride to the island, spend a day exploring and resting, and return the next day. Without thinking much, I accepted the invitation, excited about the idea of something new, something unusual. The next day, at 6 in the morning, we met at the city's port. The boat was small, a simple vessel, but enough for the journey. The weather was calm, the sea peaceful, and the sky clear, without a cloud. As we left the coast, the city faded behind us, and we began moving further away from the safety we knew, heading towards that forgotten island. Gustavo told me stories he had heard about the place, some of them not very pleasant. The island in question, called the Island of the Legend, had been a refuge for fishermen, but after a series of unexplained accidents and strange reports, it had been abandoned. People spoke of the presence of a watchman, a mysterious man who somehow continued to reside on the island, even after everyone else had left. They said he never spoke to anyone, only hiding in the shadows, observing. I didn't know what to think, but the idea of exploring such a distant place, loaded with eccentric stories, fascinated me. The boat gently rocked with the waves, and I felt at peace, although a vague premonition began to grow inside me. The journey took more than 2 hours, but finally the island appeared in view. In the distance, the silhouette of dense vegetation and the ruins of abandoned buildings began to emerge against the blue sky. The island seemed deserted, but the feeling that something was out of place started to bother me. We anchored the boat on a small, dark, sandy beach, almost hidden among the rocks, and began exploring the island. The vegetation was dense and difficult to access, but we soon found the remnants of old buildings. Fragments of stone walls and decaying wood, covered in moss and plants, were scattered everywhere. The silence was absolute, except for the sound of the waves breaking on the rocks and the distant calls of birds. As we walked, something strange began to happen. The further we moved from the beach and deeper into the island, the air seemed to grow heavier, denser. It was as if we were being watched. I couldn't identify from where, but I was sure something was there, something observing us, although we didn't know exactly what. Gustavo, who was more excited than I was, suggested we go to the old fisherman's house, a building that stood on top of a hill. They said the watchman had lived there, but no sign of him had been seen for years. The path to the house was steep and difficult, with trees bending over us, creating almost total shade. We reached the house after about half an hour of walking. The structure was still imposing, but visibly deteriorated. Broken windows, fallen doors, and a partially collapsed roof. We entered without hesitation, exploring the interior. The smell of mold and old wood was everywhere, but something about that house didn't feel right. The feeling of discomfort intensified with every step. We quickly returned to the spot where we had left the boat. The silence of the island was oppressive, and the feeling of being watched never faded. When we reached the boat and started sailing back, one last glance at the island made me realize something that still haunts me to this day. The shadows of the trees seemed to move, even without wind, and in the distance, at the base of the hill where the house stood, I saw something else. It was the silhouette of the man, standing there, like a shadow blending into the landscape. I knew he wasn't there to protect the island from people like us. He was there to make sure that the island's secret, and everything it hid, remained untouched. It was then that we found a room that seemed to have been left in an almost untouched state, as if someone had left in a hurry. A bed undone, papers scattered on the floor, and a table with some personal items still there. Something caught my attention. On one of the walls there was a framed portrait, an old photograph of a man with a stern appearance and a fixed, penetrating gaze. There was no doubt it was the watchman of the island. The feeling of discomfort grew even more, as if time itself in that house had frozen, as if something was about to happen. The tension was palpable, and before we could discuss what to do next, we heard a sound coming from outside. It was a dragging noise, as if someone was slowly moving down the hallway of the house. Gustavo looked at me with wide eyes, but before we could react, the door to the room opened. The figure that appeared there in the dim light was that of a tall, thin man dressed in worn clothes but with a calm demeanor, as if he were part of that decaying environment. He didn't say a word, but the mere fact that he was there in the doorway made us feel as if we were intruding on something much deeper than an abandoned house. Gustavo, in his usual excitement, tried to ask who he was, but the man didn't respond. He simply gestured with his hand, as if indicating for us to leave. His gaze was penetrating, almost as if he were reading our thoughts. I felt a wave of terror wash over me, and it was at that moment that I realized he wasn't there to protect the island from intruders anymore, but to ensure that it remained isolated, hiding something that should never be discovered. We stood there for a few seconds, not knowing what to do. The man didn't move. He simply stood in the doorway, watching us with an intensity that seemed impossible to describe. We decided to leave. To this day, I don't know what the watchman was protecting or what he wanted from us. All I know is that the island, with its crumbling buildings and twisted trees, held something much older and much more dangerous than anyone could imagine. A part of me feels that somehow we managed to escape from something much greater that was waiting for us, But another part of me knows that we will never forget what we saw. And as long as the watchman remains there, in the silence of the island, the answers we sought will forever remain hidden in the shadows. Here are today's stories. Some cases are truly disturbing. There are accounts of people who are still haunted by these shadow creatures. Comment on which story you liked the most, and don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed it. See you in the next stories, and if you dare to come back,